So imagine this. You're accused of a crime you didn't commit, sentenced to death, and left to wait in solitary confinement for over 50 years, hoping for a chance to prove your innocence. Well, that's been the unimaginable reality for Iwao Hakamada, a man whose story has become Japan's longest and most controversial case of wrongful imprisonment. So today we're delving into the tragic story of Iwao Hakamada, and we'll talk about how it all started in 1966, based on a supposed crime that led to his arrest, how evidence was used against him, and the decades-long battle to clear his name. And we'll also look at why in 2024, this case is back in the headlines, raising new questions about Japan's justice system. It all began in 1966 in Shizuoka Prefecture. A brutal crime shook the town when 4 members of the Yamamoto family who owned a soybean processing business were found murdered in their home, with their property burned to hide evidence. The crime was horrifying and quickly caught national attention, putting pressure on the police to find a suspect. And within just days, Iwao Hakamada, a former boxer who worked for the Yamamoto family, was arrested. But why was he the one arrested? Authorities claim to have found bloody clothing in his home, which they said matched their victims' blood types. Hakamada was also questioned for over 3 weeks in police custody without access to a lawyer, subjected to relentless, intense interrogations. And by the 20th day, he signed a confession. However, what makes this confession controversial is that Hakamada retracted almost immediately, claiming that he was beaten and pressured into signing. In Japan, there's a concept called confession culture, where confessions hold significant weight in criminal trials. But in cases like Hakamada's, the confession may have been extracted under duress, raising questions about its validity. At trial, Hakamada's confession became the focal point, and despite the lack of concrete evidence linking him to the crime, his confession and the so-called bloody clothes were presented as irrefutable proof of his guilt. The confession alone was enough for the court to sentence him to death in 1968. And just like that, his life was decided based on a signed confession under questionable circumstances. Now, Hakamada was moved to death row, where he spent the next 5 decades in solitary confinement. Every morning, he woke up not knowing if it would be his last day, because in Japan, death row inmates are only informed hours before their execution, making every day an ordeal of psychological torment. Now, Hakamada's case became a flashpoint for criticism against the Japan's legal system. And for decades, people both in Japan and internationally criticized how this case was handled, especially considering Japan's notorious conviction rate of over 99%. And for years, Hakamada's family, especially his sister Hideko, never gave up hope. They tirelessly appealed the case, and in the early 2000s, their persistence paid off, with advancements in DNA testing raising questions about the physical evidence. And testing actually showed that the DNA on the bloody clothes did not match Hakamada's, casting doubt on the reliability of the key evidence that led to his conviction. And finally, in 2014, after nearly half a century, a Japanese court ordered a retrial and released Hakamada from prison. And this was a moment of relief, but he still wasn't officially exonerated. Despite the DNA evidence, the retrial process began and dragged on for years, leaving Hakamada in a strange limbo. And although he was technically free, the legal system hadn't formally declared him innocent, meaning that he could still be returned to prison if the retrial verdict went against him. And during this time, Hakamada's mental health had deteriorated significantly. Years of isolation and the constant threat of execution had taken a severe toll on his mental health. And while this was all happening, his sister continued to be his voice, advocating for justice on his behalf. In March of 2024, the story finally took a major turn. and Japan's Supreme Court ruled to formally exonerate Iwao Hakamada, acknowledging the grave mishandling of his case. And this decision marks a major victory, not only for Hakamada and his family, but also those who are pushing for reform in Japan's justice system. So what does this ruling actually mean? Well, for Hakamada, it means he is finally officially innocent. After 50 years of living under the shadow of a wrongful conviction, his case has now sparked a national conversation about the need for reforms in Japan's judicial system, particularly around how confessions are obtained and the conditions under which suspects are detained. Now, critics argue that Japan needs stricter guidelines around police interrogations, which are often long and carried out without a lawyer present. And there are also calls for the courts to rely less on confessions, especially in serious cases where the death penalty is at stake. Now, this 2024 ruling brings hope that this high-profile case might inspire meaningful change, but for Hakamada himself, there is no way to undo the psychological and emotional damage caused by over 50 years of confinement. And really, his story is a tragic reminder of the flaws in the system and the human cost of justice that is delayed. Now, Iwao Hakamada's victory is really a bittersweet one, and while justice has finally been served, it comes far too late for a man who has lost so many precious years. And really, his story will continue to inspire advocates and reformers, pushing for a more fair, more humane system. But what do you think of all this? Should Japan and other countries with similar justice systems change how they handle interrogations and confessions? And also, what reforms do you think could prevent cases like Hakamada's from happening again in the future? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. And make sure you subscribe to keep up on all the latest news in Japan. And until next time, everyone, stay waku waku.